Pacific Ocean looked peaceful from 30,000 feet. It was a lie. Far below, scattered islands disappeared beneath layers of white cloud, while waves rolled endlessly toward distant beaches already stained by war. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Japanese fighters waited. Fast, agile, deadly. Every American pilot climbing into morning sky knew the same unsettling truth. If a Japanese Zero got behind you, there was a good chance you were already living your last few seconds. The pilots had heard every story. They spoke of Zeros that seemed to float through the air, turning impossibly tight until American aircraft filled their gun sights. Men who had survived those encounters described the enemy fighters almost like living creatures, twisting through the sky with frightening grace, while heavier American aircraft struggled to keep pace. The reports kept arriving. Another patrol missing. Another escort mission cut apart. Another pilot who never came home. Each briefing ended with new tactics, new warnings, new reminders to avoid turning fights against the Japanese. But advice only went so far once machine guns opened fire above the Pacific. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was supposed to change everything. Its twin booms stretched across the runway like the wings of some enormous metal predator. Twin Allison engines promised speed. Long range allowed it to escort bombers farther than almost any American fighter in the theater. Heavy nose-mounted guns gave pilots devastating firepower without worrying about wing-mounted convergence. On paper, it looked unstoppable. Reality was less forgiving. The Lightning could dive like a falling hammer and outrun many opponents in level flight. Yet combat rarely followed the neat diagrams drawn inside training manuals. The Zero had its own advantage. It could turn. Sometimes that single advantage erased every other strength the Americans possessed. Pilots returned from combat, describing the same helpless feeling. The moment they tried matching a Zero in a horizontal turn, the Japanese fighters seemed to swing effortlessly inside their circle. Every second spent turning meant surrendering another piece of sky until the hunter became the hunted. Many never escaped. Airfields across the South Pacific became places of uneasy silence after every mission. Ground crews counted returning aircraft long before they recognized individual pilots. Empty parking spots spoke louder than casualty reports ever could. The losses weighed on everyone, not only the men flying, but also the mechanics waiting below. Among those mechanics stood men whose names rarely appeared in newspapers. They carried no medals across their chests. They never fired their weapons in aerial combat. Yet every scratch, every leaking hose, every bent propeller blade became their responsibility. They understood something the pilots often could not. An airplane revealed its secrets only after landing, when engines cooled, when cowling panels came off, when hydraulic fluid stained concrete beneath the aircraft, when exhausted pilots admitted what they had felt in the air. One mechanic listened more carefully than most. He heard the frustration hidden beneath official reports. The airplane was powerful. The pilots were skilled. Yet something still wasn't right. Night after night, he watched a turning P-38s parked beneath dim maintenance lamps. Sweat mixed with engine oil as crews worked through the darkness. Wrenches clicked against aluminum panels while generators hummed softly across the airfield. The tropical air never seemed to cool. Salt drifted inland from the ocean. Humidity settled over everything. Steel rusted faster than anyone expected. Electrical wiring demanded constant attention. Nothing remained perfect for long. Every airplane carried new scars. Bullet holes patched with fresh aluminum. Control surfaces repaired with remarkable speed. Engines replaced before sunrise. The mechanics became surgeons operating on machines that would be expected to fight again within hours. Still, one complaint refused to disappear. The controls. Again and again, experienced pilots described the same sensation during combat. The Lightning became stubborn precisely when they needed it most. High-speed maneuvers felt heavy. Sharp turns demanded more effort than expected. Every fraction of a second mattered. Those fractions were costing lives. At first, many dismissed the complaints. Combat exhausted everyone. Fear distorted memory. Pilots often blamed machines for mistakes made under impossible conditions. The official explanation seemed reasonable until the reports kept matching. Different squadrons, Different islands, different pilots, the same problem. That pattern was impossible to ignore. The mechanic began watching control systems more closely. He inspected cables. He checked pulleys. He examined hinges worn smooth by thousands of movements. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing seemed out of place. Everything matched the technical manuals. Yet something invisible remained hidden beneath the metal skin. The mystery became an obsession. While others finished their assigned inspections, he stayed behind, flashlight in hand, hands black with grease, eyes fixed on parts most people overlooked. Some evenings, he simply sat beneath the wing thinking through every movement from cockpit controls to elevator surfaces. If the answer existed, it had to be somewhere inside that chain. One afternoon, another Lightning rolled back onto the strip after surviving a brutal engagement. Fresh holes pierced one boom. Oil streaked across its polished skin. Its pilot climbed down slowly, removed his helmet, and stared silently at the airplane. He had survived. Two of his friends had not. When questioned about the fight, his answer sounded painfully familiar. The Zero got inside my turn. No dramatic speech followed. No anger. Only quiet disappointment. The mechanic watched the pilot walk away. The words lingered long after the engine stopped ticking. That evening, the maintenance hangar stayed unusually quiet. Outside, rain hammered corrugated roofs before fading into dripping silence. Generators flickered. Mosquitoes circled exposed lamps. Somewhere in the darkness, another crew prepared replacement aircraft for tomorrow's mission. The mechanic remained beside the damaged P-38. He moved the control column by hand, watched cables tighten, watched metal flex, then stopped. Something caught his attention. Not a broken component, not a missing bolt. Something much smaller. Something almost laughably ordinary. A tiny amount of unwanted movement where force disappeared before reaching control surface. Barely noticeable. Easy to ignore. Easy enough that hundreds of inspections had missed it. He repeated the motion. Again. 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 Each time the same tiny delay appeared. It was almost nothing. Yet combat was measured in moments smaller than that. An idea slowly formed. Not from engineering textbooks. Not from official redesign plans. Just a simple thought born from watching machines fail one exhausting day after another. The solution seemed almost ridiculous. So simple that experienced men might laugh before hearing the explanation. It involved nothing more complicated than a carefully placed length of safety wire. The kind every mechanic carried. The kind used countless times for entirely different purposes. He turned the wire between grease-covered fingers. It weighed almost nothing. Surely something so insignificant could never influence one of the world's most advanced fighters. Or could it? Even he wasn't certain. Testing an unauthorized modification on a combat aircraft could bring serious consequences. If it failed, pilots might die. If it succeeded, nobody could explain why such an obvious solution had gone unnoticed for so long. Morning was only hours away. The next mission would launch whether the answer was ready or not. Standing beneath the towering twin booms of silent lightning, the mechanic faced a decision that seemed impossibly small. Yet before another sunrise, one thin piece of twisted wire would begin a chain of events that neither American pilots nor Japanese fighter aces could have imagined. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the airfield, turning puddles left by the night's rain into mirrors of pale gold. Around the rows of waiting lightnings, engines remained silent, but the base itself had already awakened. Mechanics moved with practiced urgency, carrying toolboxes, ammunition belts, and fuel hoses. No one wasted words. Every minute before sunrise belonged to preparation. The mechanic still held a short length of safety wire. Only hours earlier it had seemed like an impossible idea. Now it felt even more dangerous. Military aircraft were not machines to be experimented on. Every cable, every pulley, every bolt had been designed, tested, and approved by engineers thousands of miles away. A mechanic's job was to restore an airplane to factory condition, not improve it. Yet factory condition was not saving enough pilots. He looked once more at the control linkage hidden beneath the Lightning's aluminum skin. The movement was almost impossible to notice. When the control wheel moved, One section of the linkage hesitated ever so slightly before transferring the motion farther down the system. The delay measured only fractions of an inch. On the ground, it meant nothing. In the middle of a dogfight, it could mean everything. A Zero did not need many advantages. Just one tighter turn, one faster response, one fraction of a second. That was often enough. The mechanic had watched too many pilots return shaking their heads, unable to explain why the Lightning always seemed reluctant during the first instant of a hard maneuver. That hesitation haunted him. If the airplane answered even slightly faster, if the controls became just a little more precise, could it change the outcome? No manual offered an answer. Only combat could. He glanced across the flight line. Pilots were beginning their pre-flight inspections. Some joked with one another, forcing smiles that rarely reached their eyes. Others walked silently around their aircraft, running gloved hands along propeller blades and wing edges, performing rituals repeated before every mission. Experience had taught them one painful lesson. Any flight might be the last. One of the pilots assigned to the Modified Lightning was First Lieutenant Thomas Lynch, already earning a reputation as an aggressive fighter. He trusted his airplane, but he also understood its limitations. More than once he had watched Japanese fighters slip inside turns he could not match. He never complained dramatically. He simply adapted. But adaptation came at a cost. Every battle demanded split-second calculations. Dive instead of turning. Use speed instead of agility. Keep the fight vertical. Never let the Zero dictate the engagement. Those rules kept pilots alive. But they also surrendered opportunities. The mechanic wondered whether those rules were about to change. Working carefully, he secured the small piece of safety wire where he believed it would remove the unwanted play from the control linkage. The modification looked almost absurd. Anyone expecting a revolutionary invention would have laughed. Nothing about it appeared remarkable. There were no new parts, no redesigned mechanism, only a carefully twisted wire applying constant tension, exactly where experience suggested it was needed. He stepped back. The Lightning looked exactly as it had the day before, only he knew otherwise. For a moment, doubt returned. Had he overlooked something? Could vibration snap the wire? Could increased stress damage another component? Questions crowded his mind faster than answers. There was no time left for certainty. The engines roared to life. Twin Allison V 1710 engines shattered the morning calm one after another, sending spirals of dust across the steel mat runway. Propeller wash bent nearby grass flat against the ground. The familiar sound filled every corner of the airfield. To outsiders it sounded powerful. To the mechanics it sounded personal. Every vibration carried meaning. Every unusual note hinted at hidden trouble. The Modified Lightning taxied toward the runway. The mechanic watched until it disappeared behind other aircraft. Now the decision belonged to the sky. Minutes later the formation climbed over the coastline. The Pacific stretched endlessly beneath them, brilliant under the rising sun. Above, the air seemed perfectly calm. Appearances rarely lasted. Radar coverage remained limited across much of the Pacific. Pilots relied on lookouts, instinct, and luck. Clouds concealed danger as easily as they concealed friendly aircraft. Somewhere ahead, another group of Japanese fighters was already climbing. Neither side knew exactly where the other was, yet both understood they would meet. The silence inside the cockpit felt strangely isolated despite the constant engine noise. Thomas Lynch adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned every direction. Sunlight flashed across the canopies of nearby P-38s. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. Combat often arrived without warning. Then it happened. A voice burst across the radio. Enemy fighters. Hi. Closing fast. Almost instantly, the peaceful formation dissolved into organized chaos. American pilots increased power. Propellers bit harder into the air. The first silver flashes appeared against the blue sky as Japanese Zeros rolled into attack. Within seconds, the sky transformed into a maze of intersecting flight paths. Every pilot searched for an opening. Every mistake became visible. Machine guns erupted almost simultaneously. Bright tracer rounds stitched invisible paths through empty air. One Zero dived aggressively toward an American fighter. Another circled high, waiting patiently for someone to lose sight of him. Lynch pushed the Lightning into a defensive turn. He expected the familiar resistance. It never came. The aircraft answered almost immediately, not dramatically, not magically, just sharper, cleaner, more willing. His eyes narrowed. Had he imagined it? He pulled harder. Again, the Lightning responded with surprising precision. The delay he had unconsciously compensated for during dozens of previous fights seemed gone. There was barely time to think. A Zero swept across his nose. Instead of falling behind, the P-38 stayed closer than expected. Close enough to keep the enemy in sight. Close enough to create a possibility that had rarely existed before. The Japanese pilot noticed it too. He tightened his own turn. Normally, this was where the American aircraft would begin drifting wider. Normally, the fight would follow a familiar pattern. This time it didn't. For several breathtaking seconds, both fighters carved matching circles through the morning sky. Neither pilot broke away. Neither understood why the geometry of the fight suddenly felt different. Back on the ground, the mechanic knew none of this. He stood beside the runway, listening to distant thunder that wasn't thunder at all. Every muffled burst came from machine guns far beyond the horizon. Every fading engine note carried unbearable uncertainty. Around him, other mechanics continued repairing aircraft already damaged from yesterday's fighting. No one stopped working. Waiting accomplished nothing. Still, every few minutes, eyes drifted toward the eastern sky. Eventually, tiny specks appeared, returning aircraft. The question was no longer whether they had survived. It was how many. As the first Lightnings touched down one after another, mechanics counted instinctively. 1, 2, 3, 4. More appeared. The tally already looked better than expected. But numbers alone revealed nothing. The truth waited inside the debriefing room. And one pilot was about to describe something no one had heard before. The debriefing room smelled of wet canvas, cigarette smoke, and strong coffee that had long since gone cold. No one spoke while the pilots removed their gloves. The room was quiet in the way only combat can make it quiet. Every man understood that someone else's name might have been missing from the attendance sheet. Every empty chair carried its own story. The intelligence officer unfolded a map across the table. Colored pins marked the morning's patrol route. Another line marked the estimated location of enemy contact. Routine, almost painfully routine. But the expressions around the room were anything but. Thomas Lynch leaned forward, still wearing his flight jacket. Salt from dried sweat marked the collar. His hands showed faint traces of hydraulic fluid where he climbed over the aircraft after landing. He replayed the engagement in his mind. Something had been different. The officer began asking the familiar questions. Altitude, weather, enemy strength, direction of attack. The answers came quickly. Professional, measured, exactly as they always had. Then came a question no one expected. How did the aircraft respond? Lynch hesitated. Not because he didn't know, because he wasn't sure anyone would believe him. He glanced toward the window where mechanics continued servicing the waiting Lightnings. The controls felt. He searched for the right word. Alive? Several pilots looked up. No one interrupted. He continued. It answered before I expected it to. I wasn't fighting the airplane anymore. The room remained silent. Another pilot slowly nodded. I noticed it too. A third voice joined in. So did I. Now everyone was paying attention. The reports were nearly identical. Not dramatic, not exaggerated. Just sharper, more predictable. The Lightning seemed to go exactly where the pilot intended. For experienced fighter pilots, that difference was enormous. The intelligence officer wrote carefully. No conclusions, only observations. Yet every sentence pointed toward the same mystery. Outside, the mechanic waited beside the aircraft. He watched as ground crews rolled ladders toward the returning fighters. Fuel trucks moved between revetments. Armorers unloaded and used ammunition belts. Everything looked ordinary, until Lynch walked directly toward him. Neither man spoke immediately. The pilot rested one hand against the aluminum skin of the Lightning, then looked at the mechanic. What changed? The question carried no accusation, only curiosity. The mechanic hesitated. He knew regulations. Unauthorized modifications could end careers, possibly worse. Still, pilots deserve the truth. He described the tiny amount of slack he had discovered, the barely noticeable hesitation, the thin piece of safety wire. For a moment, Lynch simply stared. Then he laughed quietly. "You're telling me?" He shook his head. "All that," he pointed toward the fighter, "because of a piece of wire?" The mechanic wasn't smiling. "I don't know. I only know what I saw." Word spread through the maintenance crews faster than official paperwork ever could. Mechanics began examining other P-38s. Some found similar wear. Others found almost none. Every airplane told a slightly different story. Months of hard flying over tropical islands had affected each machine differently. Salt, heat, constant vibration, combat damage. Nothing stayed factory perfect for long. The discovery raised another question. If one aircraft improved, would others? Maintenance officers faced a difficult choice. No official order existed. No engineering bulletin approved the modification. Everything rested on practical judgment. Meanwhile, combat refused to wait. Another escort mission launched 2 days later. This time, more Lightnings carried the small adjustment. Again, they climbed into the bright Pacific sky. Again, Japanese fighters appeared. Again, the pilots expected the familiar struggle. Instead, several reported something remarkable. The Lightning still wasn't as agile as a Zero. No mechanic could change physics. The American fighter remained larger, heavier, built for different priorities. But now pilots reached the edge of its performance more confidently. They wasted less energy correcting the airplane. Tiny improvements accumulated. One cleaner turn, one steadier gun solution, one extra second with the enemy in sight. Those moments began changing fights. Japanese pilots noticed. Veteran Zero pilots relied on instinct developed through hundreds of engagements. They recognized familiar American tactics almost immediately. Fast diving attacks, high-speed passes, avoid horizontal turning contests. Those patterns had become predictable. Now something felt different. American fighters seemed more willing to stay engaged, not recklessly, confidently. The difference was subtle, but experienced opponents noticed subtle things first. One Japanese pilot later recalled that certain American fighters no longer seemed to hesitate before changing direction. Instead of floating briefly through the turn, they reacted more decisively. Not enough to erase the Zero's legendary maneuverability. Enough to complicate every engagement. The balance was shifting. Back at the airfield, maintenance crews worked almost without pause. Every successful mission brought new questions. Could the adjustment be improved further? Were some control systems wearing faster than others? Was the wire solving the problem, or merely hiding a deeper one? Inspectors began measuring cable tension more carefully. Pilots became more specific during debriefings. Mechanics listened more closely than ever before. For the first time, pilots and ground crews were solving the same problem together. Neither could succeed alone. Then another challenge emerged. Newly arrived replacement aircraft behaved differently. Fresh from American factories, they lacked many of the small imperfections found in combat-worn Lightnings. Some needed no adjustment. Others developed similar issues only after weeks of heavy flying. That realization changed everything. The problem wasn't simply design. It was time, where thousands of vibrations slowly changing the aircraft in ways almost too small to measure. Almost. The mechanic who first noticed a tiny hesitation never claimed he had reinvented the P-38. He understood machines too well for that. He knew every aircraft changed with age. The real achievement had been seeing something everyone else had accepted as normal and refusing to ignore it. Soon, engineers higher up the chain of command began requesting more detailed maintenance reports. Patterns emerged. Questions multiplied. Some would eventually influence future inspection procedures. Others would inspire engineering improvements beyond the Pacific. But before those lessons reached factories, the skies over Solomon Islands were about to deliver an even greater test. Because the Japanese were changing their tactics. And this time, a single piece of wire would not be enough.